Jill, welcome to the Modern People Leader. We're so happy to have
Great.
you.
Thanks for having me. It's great
Yeah,
to be
so
here.
you're our second guest from PTC.
Oh,
We
wow.
chatted with Hallie Bregman, your former head of people analytics a while
Yep.
back, and that's what led us to you. So, yeah, for everyone listening, Jill is the chief people officer at PTC, a 7,000 employee company, and has been in the CHRO chief people officer role since 2008. Is that right? About then?
Yes, for quite a while. I go back and forth between talent and CHRO, depending on, where we are and what the opportunity is.
Yeah, so we're super excited to pick your brain. And yeah, thanks for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks. As you can tell, it's our holiday. We're entering sort of the crazy holiday season.
No, I love so for all of our listeners, both Stephen and Jill are wearing, how would you describe those? Christmas tree light
Sort of
necklaces
like
or
the old school lights, Now you get all
Yeah.
the little LED ones, but these are the old school ones.
yeah, it's a good look. I forgot mine,
You
but
we you didn't get the memo, Daniel.
No.
I didn't, but that's okay. Cool. So we like to kick off all of our podcasts with good news stories. This is personally my favorite part of the podcast. It forces me to, think of the little things in life that I'm thankful for, whether it's at work or it's something that's personal. But yeah, we like to kick off every conversation where each of us goes around and shares a good news story. And I guess just to make it easier on everyone while y'all are thinking, I can share mine. So um, starting the 23rd, I will be taking, PTO, or actually we have off the entire week after Christmas. So I won't be working again until New Year. So
Wow.
really excited to take some time to myself and recharge and hang out with family and friends and eat a lot of good food. So yeah, that's my good news story.
That's great.
Who
Bill,
wants
you
to
want
go
to go
next?
next, or you want me to take the mic here?
I can go next.
Okay.
I have one that's a little more related to what I do. But I had posted and amplified the fact that Lena Nair, who is a CHRO of Unilever, was just announced as the CEO of Chanel. And
Oh wow.
that is, I do know
Wow.
her. I followed her for a long time, super dynamic, really kind of pushing the edge of some things around the CPO role. Also just a really amazing human being. And it's like a triple, female, minority, and also a CHRO. So that's my work related one this week. I just think it's awesome. I really believe that we should have many, many more CHROs in the CEO seat and on board. So it was just, that's my professional one.
Nice. Well, we have lots of questions for your as far as your views on how the CHR role is changing and where it's going. So I think we can chat a little bit more about that later. My good news story, I'm going to go, this is our second conversation this week, and the last one I went personal. I'm going to go personal again. I am 90% done with Christmas shopping. And guys, I know that
There
sounds
you
bad.
go.
I am notoriously last minute shopper for all things Christmas, and have had to resort to like going to like brick and mortars to buy my gifts. So I am in very good shape this year. So that's my good news.
Awesome.
Better than me. I'm like 80% the way there. I actually had to go to a bunch of brick and mortar stores last night, so I'm
I
catching up.
really don't know where I am because I have a number of boxes that remain unopened since I have been really busy. So I'll find out this weekend. Could be 20%, could be 60%. No idea.
You'll get there. You'll get
I'll
there.
get there.
So Jill, talk us through your story and how it all culminated in you becoming the chief people officer at PTC. I also see that you're on several boards. So yeah, just give us the quick 2 to 4 minute journey of how you got to where you're at today.
Sure. So I started in recruiting. I wanted to be a journalist and ended up in recruiting. Interesting left-hand turn there. But I ended up, I started in my first role at an agency. So I was, a headhunter for, kind of an old school word for it. And I found that I really loved the candidate side I did not love the dialing for dollars side of it, and just felt that that probably wasn't my journey. And so I went in-house. I was a contract recruiter for a number of years, and then I became the only HR person in a lot of startups during the dot-com boom. So, in my very early in my career, really having to navigate, CEOs, private equity, VCs, a lot of companies going public. And so that's really how I got started in the journey. I did not have a lot of formal HR training. I did end up getting formal HR training as I went. I have my master's in HR, and then I got a certificate and a PHR. But, that's how I got kind of indoctrinated into it. And then went in-house for some larger companies. So I was at SunGard for 7 years. I ran HR for 2 different divisions for them. And we were a very large public company, and we went private. And so that was really fascinating. Lots of different founders and startups having to be organized into 4 market segments. And so that's where I started my transformation change kind of agent type of journey. Went to EMC, was there for 5 years, ran HR for RSA, which many people know from a cybersecurity perspective. And then I moved over to EMC for my last year. And I really did a lot of the operational sides of HR, also engagement, communications, analytics, a lot of things I just felt like I hadn't really learned in my journey. My journey had been lots of talent and programs and things like that. And so kind of circled that out. And then my CHRO from SunGard went to Cisco. And I went to Cisco for 5 years. I ran recruiting for all 5. And then I also took on lots of other parts of HR. And so I had workforce planning. I was the head of DEI for a while, so did a ton there. And then I ran HR for services, which was a 13,000 person business. So I basically had kind of half of HR for Cisco. And then right before PTC, I was at Metadata, and I was there as a CHRO for 2 years. I would have stayed there for a really long time, was in New York City, had a wonderful place in Soho, and got to commute. And they ended up getting bought. And so they got bought by Dassault, who interestingly is a competitor of PTC in a completely different space. So, but they actually powered a lot of the vaccines during COVID, and we're still obviously during COVID. So really, really interesting company, 30-year clinical trial management company, going to SaaS. So lots of transformation in my background. And so when Metadata got bought, I decided maybe it'd be good to come back into Boston. The PTC role was open. I hadn't been back in Boston for quite a while. I commuted to California and New York for those, for Cisco and Metadata. So kind of came full circle, and I'm at a company that's based in Boston, which I've lived in Boston, Boston area pretty much my whole life.
What an amazing story.
How many total relocations have you had in your career?
So I actually have never
curious.
relocated. So we can chat about this one. I have a husband who's a firefighter. And so he has a very flexible job. I have twin boys who are 17. And so I have commuted and had apartments in places. And I just have a phenomenal spouse who has really been very supportive of my career. So I actually have never relocated for any of those jobs. But I have had some nice apartments in New York and in San Jose, down in Florida for a while for SunGard. So I've been commuting for quite a while.
That's awesome. So tell us a little bit about PTC. Maybe just quickly describe your core product or service, how many employees. Sure. I think I mentioned 7,000. Mm-hmm. And how many markets do you operate in? That kind of stuff.
Sure. So we have 7,000 employees. We are about $1.5 billion in revenues. The company has been around for 35 years. It is a technology company, very focused in industrial and manufacturing, which is a new space for me. So one of the things I try to do when I move into roles is to continue learning. And so, did life sciences and Metadata, now industrial and manufacturing at PTC. We are in a number of different markets. So half of our revenues are actually outside the United States, as well as half of our employees. So we have a large population all over Europe, and then also in Asia, in addition to about, just about 3,000 employees in the United States. And so Boston is our headquarters, and we play in a couple different spaces. We are most known for CAD, and so we have a product called CHRO, which is a product that has been around for 35 years. So we work primarily with, auto manufacturers, airlines, defense, anything that needs to be built. And so our purpose statement is actually the power to create, which is really around the fact that our technology helps other companies create, but we also create with our technology. We also have a portfolio called Product Lifecycle Management, which is really kind of how you do the feature functionality of all your products. That is a product called Windchill. Our CEO is actually from Minnesota and is the founder of that particular product portfolio. And then we have sort of two other portfolios. One is IoT, which is really around the Internet of Things, connected devices, connected manufacturing, and all of the AI and data that you get from that. And then we have a portfolio that is really around augmented reality and starting to move into spatial. So when you think about things like how the Amazon warehouses, how the robots kind of move and how you map that out and that sort of thing. We do a lot around sort of 3D modeling and beyond. And so we have those 4 portfolios and we have a whole SaaS side of our business. So for all those portfolios, we are working on cloud versions of all of those. And so that's the big transformation we're doing here with this 35-year-old company, is pivoting to the cloud and taking our customers with us, with the pandemic really driving a lot of that. And very long tenured manufacturing companies, industrial companies that really couldn't go into their warehouses and had to actually continue to design virtually. So it's been really, really interesting to watch that disruption as the chief people officer here.
Awesome. You guys have quite a sprawling business. And it's one of the things I love about hosting a leadership, people focused podcast is to, obviously we are, our main area of focus is you and your experience and your style of leadership and all the great things you have to share. But learning about companies that I'm sure touch so many aspects of our lives, but we would never know that you provide the software that allows, warehouses or whatever it is to function super efficiently. So I can live, my life as simply and easily as I can. So thanks for sharing about that. The other part of what I love in hosting this podcast is learning about your career advice. So my next question for you, Jill, it's really, there are 2 questions in this kind of subsection. And the first is, what is the one piece of advice that has transformed your career, and how did it do that?
Sure. I grew up in a, very Irish Catholic kind of, with an Irish Catholic family, very big family. My father's one of 10, my mother's one of 4. I have 56 cousins on both sides. And it sounds interesting, but for me, it was always kind of the do unto others. It was sort of that golden rule. And I have seen this in my career around perspective taking. If you're in a situation where you are encountering something, you're trying to put yourself in that person's shoes, really understanding the scenario, how are they seeing things? And so it's just been something that I grew up with and has really served me well. And I've had in my career, I've had a number of individuals I've had to, lay off, who've actually come back to work for me in other roles. And it's really for me about understanding what it must be, having empathy, which obviously during the pandemic is serving us really well. But it is something that for me has really been kind of at the core of who I am, is just really thinking about, what would it be like if that was happening to me, or what is the perspective somebody must have when they're going through this. And so, so that is, probably the big one. I think there's another one for me, which is really about knowing your value, which is something that has been relatively more recent for me as I've started to navigate sitting in the C-suite, being the only female in many places, whether it's in the, in the executive rooms I'm in or in the boardroom, but also just sort of understanding, your value, but also your value system. And I think that's incredibly important to understand what is your ethical core, because that's something that somebody can't take away from you unless you let them take it. And so if you know those things about yourself, hopefully, you become an authentic leader, and hopefully you, if you're kind of driven by your value system, you'll do the right things, and you can be proud of the work that you've done and the impact that you've had, and the interactions you've had with people, whether they're positive circumstances or difficult ones.
Love that. I love that. And thinking about, the course of your career, that can also, if you're asking yourself and you're checking in, like, what is the value that I can add, or what, how is this aligning with my value system? Right. That's going to change over time. And so I like that, because that's something you can revisit and really have a candid, honest assessment of yourself. Like, am I in the right job? Right. Am I, is the company and the team that I'm working with, realizing the value that I can add and giving me the opportunities? I feel like a lot of people are starting to trend in looking life that way. And as a result, there's a lot of turbulence as far as attrition. So the flip side of my last question is, what's the worst advice you've ever received?
Well, when you're a change agent and you're someone who really wants to encourage people to think differently, operate differently, try different things, sometimes the word collaboration can be used as a bat. And I've seen it used a number of times where when people are afraid of change, or they just simply don't want to change, you will get some feedback such as, well, you don't collaborate well, or you didn't socialize that well. And, earlier in my career, because I'm confident, I'm a risk taker, I'm constantly challenging myself to work differently, to operate, look at the world differently, continue to try to adapt. I used to really spend a lot of time stressing out about like how other people, am I collaborating enough, or am I having enough meetings so everybody knows? And then I finally had this moment where I sort of looked back and said, maybe it's actually not me. Maybe that word is used in a way that it's misused, so that it's an easy sort of adjective to use, or verb, depending on how you're using it, that doesn't get at some of the fear and other things that are really happening around, what I call antibodies, or people who don't want to change, or people are afraid of change, or, know how fast you're moving, and know they can't move that fast. So, it really took me some time to be able to mature around that, to say, okay, this is who I am authentically. You can certainly evolve on how you try to drive change. But I just had this aha moment, where I just realized, what? That's so fascinating. I have all these individuals who try to hire me different places and work with me different places. And so maybe it's actually not collaboration. Maybe it's something else, maybe it's a diamond, it could be gender. I don't know, but it actually led me. So that is probably the worst advice, of like, well, you need to collaborate more, or you need to, because it's like, well, tell me more, like, help me take that, take that apart a little bit.
Yeah, and I have to ask, as a follow-up, do you think some of that could be because you are you're the way that you're wired as a professional, and the fact that you're a female leader as well?
I think it could be that too. You start, most humans want to be liked, and most, so, you sort of start with, well, what's wrong with me, and what do I need to do differently? But I agree, as I'm starting to see things, I start to see patterns of things. You start to see microaggressions, all these things that now have terms, but when I was going through them, a lot of people never talked about those things, and
or that's just the way it is, like that.
Exactly. Or you just gotta, you shouldn't speak in, if somebody that's just how Joe is, or that's, just really fascinating things. And I think I've learned to question and unpack more of that, to say, okay, I can always continue to be better, but maybe there is something else playing out here, and I just need to step back for a moment and say, wait a minute. Perspective really helps sometimes, but also having more confidence to realize, wait a minute, not going to that place of, oh, it must be, I must be doing it all wrong. So I found over the years that term, especially when you're trying to drive larger changes, actually has a lot of, it's used incorrectly, I think, sometimes as a way. It sounds like a positive term, but I've seen it misused.
I could see that completely. Yeah. Well, moving on, because I could stop there and jump into a whole conversation,
a whole performance management dialogue about how antiquated that is.
Exactly, but we have some great things that we want to dig into. So, and I don't want to run out of time. So, you've been in a variety of chief people officer, head of HR roles at a variety of amazing organizations. We recently, I can't remember who it was, but someone just mentioned how pivotal Cisco was in their career that we recently had. I think it was Barbie. That's right.
Barbie Brewery.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so how has that role changed over the last, 10, 15 years? And where do you see the role going from here?
Well, I think there are constant forces of change happening right now around people and the future of work. And this has been something I have been really talking about for a long time, pre-pandemic, and have done a lot around it. But what I think is so fascinating right now about the role is that it really is now front and center during the pandemic. Which I think is serving us amazingly. I think in some cases, it's also highlighting places where the function is being disrupted, quite frankly. And so I think, for me, as I think about the CPO role, on any given day, I am, we're dealing with contact tracing, we're dealing with the evolving landscape of that. We're dealing with shareholders. We just had our investor day here yesterday. What are we doing around ESG? What are we doing around human capital? What's our diversity strategy? So what's our pay for performance, and how are we responding to say on pay and shareholders? But then on another day, we'll be trying to figure out how to launch Workday and how to figure out the right people analytics. And so I think what's so fascinating is that there are now, it's like expanding so much because it really touches all sorts of parts of businesses. It always did, but I don't think people really quantified it. So if you think about one of the, if not the most important investment that a company makes that drives revenue, it's their talent. And, the culture is obviously how you start to really amplify and accelerate your talent and create an impression, whether it's products or experiences or whatever, services, whatever it is your company does. But I just think we're in sort of this revolution right now of people, and people actually having a lot more advocacy, people having more power, quite honestly, to say, I am going to work there, or I'm not, or I'm going to get paid this, and you can't ask me what, like, this is what I think I'm worth. And it's just really, really fascinating, but it can be challenging because it's actually really breaking down a lot of the foundational tenets of a function that has been around and really needed to disrupt itself. And so, you think about cost of living and all these things around compensation, like lots and lots of things are being questioned and challenged right now that were really foundational elements of the human resources role. So I think the whole thing is evolving, and we're all trying to be agile and disruptive and still try to have some stability at the same time in a landscape that's constantly changing.
So the voice of the people leader, chief people officer, whatever you want to call that role, is been amplified, and there's been a critical need for someone to lean into that kind of voice, that role. Do you think that the other leaders, the other executives, are listening more than they were in the past?
I do. I think there's sort of two things happening right now. I think there's a demographic situation happening right now with the generations. And I think when you look at what's going on with the pandemic and who's embracing the pandemic, you're finding that it's sort of millennial Z and maybe the Xers that are kind of trying to stay with the millennial Z side. But you are seeing those that are, in my opinion, sort of longer tenured or more in those leadership roles are really struggling with, like, how do you handle this Zoom thing? And how do you, and I'm not criticizing, I can totally understand if you're very used to having a way of doing things. But I think that's one of the big pieces here is really understanding that everyone is changing. And so we're all sort of doing it at the same time. And we're all coming from different places of safety and psychological safety and what it is that we want our foundation to be. So I think that is incredibly challenging too. Both all of us are doing it, but then all our employees and our leaders are doing it, and the entire kind of world is doing it at the same time.
So going back to your good news, do you think we're going to see more? Is this a trend of the CHRO becoming, more CHROs or chief people officers being promoted to CEOs?
I do, because what you're seeing out there right now is how do you harness this sort of wave? Like, should you be, virtual? Should you be hybrid? Should you, how you create culture? How do you do those things? And then if you don't do them well, then you've got the great resignation situation, which you could still do them well and be impacted by that, because I think some of that also has to do with just the last 2 years and people wanting personal choice on things. But, I think for us, it's just very, very, it's eye-opening, but it also requires us to figure out sort of who do you want to be as you're navigating this? Like what are your go-tos? Like, what are the things that you're gonna, you can't change everything all at the same time, but yet, even if you're not changing, it's changing anyway, right? So it's, it's
That's the thing, is the ship is sailed,
the
guys.
ship is say, like, you're either, I always joke, you're in the, you're either in the front, the back, or you're in the middle somewhere, hoping nobody pays attention to you.
Yeah. And, something you said was that everyone is changing.
Mhm.
And, one thing that was mentioned on the last episode that we had with Darren Murph, who's the head of remote at GitLab, was that leaders have this permission slip to try new things.
Yeah.
And this is like, the first time that that's ever happened for leaders, where because there's so much change going on, it's like the one time in our life where we can try new things without it getting scrutinized.
Right.
And you mentioned that you see this as an evolution for the HR function. So I'm just curious, are there any, themes and changes that you're seeing out there? Like, what do you think will be some of the biggest changes that come out of this evolution?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I think the first one is it's not really clear anymore what the entree to HR is. So, historically, you could have been recruiter, you could have been a benefits administrator, you could have come in as a, sort of low-level comp analyst. Like, if you think about the ways people got in, well, a lot of those roles have been automated. A lot of those, like, you can now get it, if you're using newer technology, and most companies are starting to pivot to that, that you don't really need a human necessarily to answer some of those entry level questions. So then the question becomes kind of, where is your entree, right? Is it through learning? Oh, well, a lot of that is automated too. So I think part of this is trying to figure out what is HR in the future, and is it called something to, a lot of us call ourselves people officers, your people and culture and communities, or, there's lots of, so I think that there's a reason for that, because kind of the locus of work is moving, and I think it's still trying to redesign itself in some way. And, when you think about even things like compensation and specialties in places, well, what happens if there isn't a cost of living adjustment? What happens if you can go live in a much, cheaper, suburban location instead of a city? Should you be paid differently? If you're virtual and you're not in person, should you be paid differently? Like, these are real questions that are happening right now. And there's no textbook for us to go, case law tends to be, one of the things. So we look at what happens. But even that is, probably 4 to 6 years behind. So should we mandate vaccines? Should we not? Well, I guess we're going to find out. Which one's the right answer, not because it's not the right answer for science, but because it's also about what are the rights and what's employment law going to say, and how's that, if you look at something like Uber, they've been sued for multiple things. They've been sued for employees not being treated as gig workers, and for gig workers not being treated as employees. So you're sort of like, okay, well, we've paid fines on both. Which one are we? And so all of that is evolving. It's incredibly challenging because you don't have anything to work from. A very data-driven person, I can't, as you're navigating some of these things, there isn't an obvious answer as to, which one, do you stick with the tried and true, or do you try something totally different around compensation? Do you let people choose? Like, you're seeing equity being used really differently right now, and you got lots of board members that say, well, we can't use equity. Why? You can't give them a 1-year vest. Why are you giving 25-year-olds equity? Well, because we can't hire them if we don't, but it's really challenging, right? Because you have to decide who you are and know your philosophy. But all of these things that historically HR practitioners have learned, a lot of them are irrelevant. They're just becoming irrelevant. It's really, really fascinating.
Well, yeah, you had me at the very beginning of that last response, because I started my career as an HR consultant in the global mobility function.
Yeah.
And that function has been turned upside down. Like, our job was to relocate people, and like that, the foundations of that sub function within HR, like
Right.
is totally, complete disruption.
Right.
Like I would not be hired to do that job
Mhm.
in today's market. Like
Well,
it just won't exist.
there's SaaS products that do it, there's like product like Envoy that does all the legal and the taxation, and so you don't even actually really need humans, to do some of that stuff. People can interact with a third party or portal, or it's pretty amazing.
And
Yeah.
so go ahead, Daniel, go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just going to say, I feel like, what you were just describing as the evolution of HR, and basically how everything's being turned upside down and people are being forced to do things differently across the board, whether that's, how they're getting into the HR function. Maybe they're coming from different functions, or just having a completely different approach to everything. And, it feels like that was the long way of explaining what digital transformation looks like in HR. But I'm curious, is there anything that you would add to expand on that? This is something that we're hearing a lot about in our conversations, but yeah, would just love for you to expand on that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the mistakes that people make when they talk about digital transformation is that they make it about the technology.
Yeah.
And so, they immediately make it about, like Workday, like Workday is going to solve it is not. It is,
it's people.
It is a set of business processes. Yes, it has modules and apps, and it's user friendly, and it's probably much better, and it is much better than some of the things we have. But the bigger thing is really around, what is the experience? What is the workflow? Who are your personas? A lot of design thinking, how do you think about that? And then how do you disrupt that? And so we just, we're going through this ourselves because we're a 35-year-old company. And so, there are 20 things that a new hire has to do. And so we're like, well, why? Why do we have to do 20 things? Well, we need to do this, and they need to check the box. We'll do, okay, maybe they need to do those things, but how many of those things have to hit them right when they start? Like, what do you really want them to get jazzed about when they start? And some companies do this really well and some don't. And so I think when we talk about digital transformation, it's lots of different things. It's the processes, it's the workflow, it's the experience, how you want to engage, what kind of culture do you want to have? But it's also about the data and the insights, and how can you be much more proactive to make better decisions and insightful decisions that are powered by intelligence. And then lastly, I think it's really about, you can go on your phone and do whatever. Like, you can order your Christmas gifts from, Amazon or whatnot. You can do those things, but you come into these workplaces, and many of us can't. We go back in time. And so I think that's really the power of thinking through this, to say, what experience do we want? And then where do we really want to have higher touch? Like, where do we really want to put our headcount and our investment from a human resources perspective?
Yeah, love that. I feel like a lot of times digital transformation is used as like this like blanket term for anything. And I don't know. I love how you explained it right there. And one thing that you mentioned was being data driven.
Mm-hmm.
So I know you're a big fan of a data driven HR model. What does being data driven in HR look like to you?
Well, I think the first thing is about, how can you give more access to data? I think historically, finance and HR and some of these functions have been very sort of like, oh, we're the ones, you come to us and we give you the data. And I think what's amazing now is the prevalence of being able to aggregate data, being able to look at it, being able to predict. And so one of the big things for us is really around, what are the important elements of data? What can we learn from it that actually allows us to make more intelligent decisions around our people, around our customers, whatever it is that we think are levers that are going to drive our business strategy. And so for me, it's really thinking about, some of the things I'm looking at right now, what's happening with our new hires. So if I go back the last 2 years during the pandemic, have we had early attrition? Why is that? Are there certain groups? What's happening with our diverse representation? Are we converting diverse slates? Just sort of things that some companies are further ahead. Again, we're a 35-year-old company, but I think there's other things for us too around what's the impact of things that we're doing. So when we go into the boardroom, or when I'm looking for new board members, we've hired 2 new board members since I've been here. We have, we're going through that right now to evolve, to bring more of those skills in. what are the types of skill sets that we need? Who are people that we admire connected to, and how can we start to look for those candidates a little bit differently? And just really understanding more around the kind of capabilities that we have in our company, and where are the gaps, what do we need to be hiring for, and then how do you do that? So things like that, I think, are ways that we can add a lot of value and really help leaders, many of whom have never used data like this, depending on, how long your company's been around and who's in it. A lot of them don't know how to use data in the right way. You give them this data and like, I don't know what to do with this. I'm like, oh, what's my underrepresented minority engagement? What does that mean? How do I have that conversation? And so then it becomes much more of a consultative dialogue.
Yeah. If you're allowed to share with us, I'm curious, have there been any interesting findings from some of this work you've done?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the company. I think for PTC, we've had a myriad of systems. We haven't had a strong history of capturing data, reflecting on the data, learning from the data. So a lot of what's happened in the first 2 years has been actually, we brought Visier to showcase the data. So we've got all these leaders now that can look at dashboards and helping them understand the dashboards. We're actually just about to launch Workday in January. And, we're showing the leaders these apps, it sounds crazy, but, they've always had to go into a place and find these different things. And so for us here, we're looking at our demographic. One of the aha moments we had was realizing that almost 60% of our population is under the age of 30. And I told my leaders this, and they literally, no, that's not possible. That's not true. It is true. And, so we've acquired these companies and we're moving to SaaS, and, so we've been hiring a lot in early career, but nobody actually went back and looked at it in aggregate and said, we really have to think about how we're looking at our benefits, what we're offering, because when we're talking at our leadership level, we're really only talking about 300 of our people, and most of those are not necessarily in, sort of the Z and millennial generation. So how are we getting at that bigger population? And so I would say that was probably one of the first aha moments during COVID. I'm the first CHRO that's actually reported into the CEO of PTC. So that's another thing here, is that they aren't used to having those conversations in the executive leadership team. And so, the pandemic, I would say it was a blessing and a curse, and for me, because it came 8 weeks after I started at PTC. So I had to get to know our CEO very quickly. But they've learned a lot about culture and pivoting to culture first. And I really think it's changed the game for us, because they just didn't have access to some of those things. And so when you're thinking about how to build culture virtually, these leaders have that if we don't know what your demographic is, you don't even know where to start. Like, what's interesting to those individuals? What's a common denominator in teams that we can actually pivot around?
Well, I think it's awesome that you brought this up a couple of episodes ago. Daniel, we do guest conversations like this. We also do one-on-one riffs where we'll tear down an article, or we'll go deep into a specific topic. And Daniel, his choice for our last riff was Gen Z. And it's interesting. And some of the statistics were a complete blind spot for me. And I operate in HR and data and engage. Like, this is what I do. This is all I've ever done. Yeah. And I still it still caught me by surprise that by 2025, Gen Z is projected to make up 27% of the workforce. And that number, because we look at engagement data for our clients all the time, and the Gen Z generational cohort is usually a very, very small cohort. It has been a small cohort for companies, and the scores are always lower scoring or different for Gen Z, I should say, not always lower. And but it's kind of minimized as like, oh yeah, that's a small group. And to think that in the next 3-4 years, that the percentage of our workforce is going to change so dramatically, it's kind of crazy to think about that.
It's already happening though. Like, the revolution is already happening. It's so funny, because that is where you're seeing all these dialogues about, are you fully virtual or are you, I'm a big dog person, so I can see the dogs in the back.
Sorry about that.
And are you fully virtual? Are you hybrid? Are you, and it's just fascinating. I said I have 2 boys that are 17, they're complete digital natives. Like, they don't want to be taught. They don't want, my son will show me YouTube videos and, how they do things. And, I'm doing PowerPoint. He's like, Mom, do this Google Doc thing. And, and you just do it here. Like, and it's amazing. And we're
That's
spending
totally
a lot
me.
of time trying to understand, just sort of, wow, okay, how do we just engage with them? And it's all sort of real time. And, but I think the other thing with them, and I hate to generalize a generation, but there are some themes and trends here, is really, they have to save the world. I really believe that they have to save the world. And that is a great pressure. And they are the ones that have gone through this pandemic in a different way, because their childhood, if they're at the sort of tail end of this, has been completely irrevocably impacted. And so, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with them, of, how we're going to evolve and what's going to, what does work look like? Because they, both my children say they're never going to sit in an office like me. They don't understand that. Like, why do you deal with all these people and their crap? And, like, I hear these are kids, they're boys, but it's like, it's pretty
but it's our
interesting to see
future.
their point of view.
It's representative of the future. And I think because we've been so focused, everything has been about the pandemic, that I think what part of what you're saying is, like, this isn't, the revolution has begun. The pandemic, was a catalyst and accelerated a lot of things that were already in flight.
Right.
And these aren't pandemic issues. This is just, we got a shifting, generation, and there are differences about that generation in terms of how we engage them, how we motivate them, how we retain them. And so I think it's exciting, and it'll be interesting to see, the millennial conversation was, like, I feel like a decade long conversation, honestly, about the change.
But it's still very relevant, because now you've got those 2 generations really making up a pretty, over this next period of time, a pretty significant part of the workforce. And they're not the same. They're very different, but they're also massively different than the Xers and the boomers, who are all in these leadership roles. So I just am so fascinated to see what this starts to look like, because they are disrupting. You sit in these rooms and people are like, well, they only have 2 years. They only stayed at this company for 2 years, and it was like 18 months. And I'm like, yeah, well, wow. What if retention is actually not a good gauge of your culture or your company's success anymore? Like, I teach sometimes at Columbia, and I ask these questions, and I sort of say, well, like, what if this, you're measuring all these things, and what if those are actually the complete wrong things to measure as to whether your company is successful or not with talent?
Yeah, that's one thing that Steve Cadigan, who we had on the podcast a couple of months ago, he said the same thing. He's like, what if not all retention is bad?
That's
like,
right.
I mean, I think he gave multiple examples, but one of them was, every time you go to a new company, you're expanding your network. Every time you go to a new company, you're being exposed to new skills.
Right.
And maybe the goal of the company shouldn't be to retain the employee, but help them get their dream job.
Yeah,
and
I think there's a lot of companies that have gotten really smart about this around alumni, and people leave and they become customers, and sometimes they come back, and that is the Cisco story. You hear that a lot. There's lots of people leave Cisco and come back, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Things that are super sticky in their culture that make it a really fun place. But I also think we're just going to have to look at this really differently to figure out, how do you still drive revenues and do all the things that are incredibly important to shareholders, regardless of what industry you're in, and to, being successful and successful in the world as far as your impact. But I just think I think that the dialogue is just very different, and it's going to be very different in the future. And the things that, are going to be important to why you want to leave a job or go to a job are going to be not the things that we normally talk about now, this is what we do and the revenues and that sort of thing. It's going to be, well, what have you done for the community? What kind of impact do you have there? What's your carbon, what's your greenhouse gas? What's your car? I just really think now you're seeing your investing, your investment worthiness with the S&P, now has an ESG rating. And, you know, a lot of that pressure is coming. It's actually coming from some of the younger generations, not necessarily coming from the demographic that's in the C-suite and the boardroom. In fact, many of them are surprised by a lot of this, which is so fascinating.
I'm smiling because the last guest we had on, Darren Murph, GitLab, he proposed an alternative to Zoom happy hours, and it was community impact outings.
Absolutely.
And he walked
that.
us through the impact that companies could have if, rather than designating, you know, an hour a week to a Zoom happy hour, they designated that hour a week for everybody in the company to go out and do something for their community.
Yeah.
And that would be a way of culture building, and the culture would be built outside the walls of the office, and that would be what, you know, people are attracted to as a company. So sorry, I just had to get that in there. I was smiling as you were saying it, because
I think what's fascinating right now is the companies that are doing that organically without having to, you know, think about, you know what I mean? And so like when we went through the pandemic, it was amazing to see what happened with our 3D, like printing of masks, and we had teams going, and it wasn't something that we sort of organized. It happened really organically, where people said, we have technology, we have things we can do to help. You know, we offered our technology for education because a lot of the teachers and professors couldn't access any of the CAD software because it was all on-prem and you couldn't get in because of everything going on. And so like, I think about that, and I think there's lots of cultures out there that do that organically. And I think those are the companies that are going to really have the strategic differentiation, because they already do it naturally. They don't have to organize a wine o'clock or a, you know, community service moment, or, you know, and I'm not saying that that's phenomenal for companies to really pivot on that. And the more that do, the better impact we'll have in the world. But there are a lot of companies that are naturally doing that right now. And I think it's a big strategic differentiator for them.
I agree. One of the things that, you know, as we close this year and we look to next year, is how much I'm beginning to realize that the companies that are able to lean into change organically, how much of a lead in the race for, you know, attracting talent, you know, whatever the future is going to be, the companies that are leaning in are getting it. It's like, you know, in the startup kind of SaaS product world, you know, you talk a lot about escape velocity. Like you get so far ahead that no one can catch up. You know, Tesla in the EV market, like whatever, there are so many different examples. And in the people market, I believe the companies that are leaning in and really are able to do these things organically are going to start achieving escape velocity in terms of their ability to attract and retain talent. And so this whole conversation, Jill, has been awesome. And I feel like the question I'm about to ask, you have been dropping nuggets through the whole conversation, but we have a crystal ball question. We ask all of our guests that come join us. Do you have, in addition to everything you've shared, or anything kind of, you know, in particular that you want to go back to and highlight, you know, what are your predictions on future trends? Like, you know, huge changes that we may see in the future about the way we work.
Yeah, I think a big one is really going to be around employees having multiple jobs. And it's not just gigs, because gigs is a little bit different. I'm talking about, you know, this mindset, you only do one job, you know, you're in one company and that's your day, you know, like, I think you're going to start to see people actually curate their careers so that it's like, in the mornings I do this, or, you know, in the summer I'm going here and I do this work. And I think that's really going to happen. And it's actually going to be very affordable for people to do that, because of the fact that the talent gap is so massive now. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of you know, kind of new talent that you're going to be able to leverage. And so I think what's going to happen is that we're going to continue to see this acceleration of the individual having choice, whatever that is. You know, they're going to work 20 hours a week. They're not going to work. They're going to do, you know, I think it's going to be really, really fascinating. I think a lot of that is also what's driving the great resignation, because there are, I know you see everybody saying, I'm going to this job or that job. There are a lot of people that aren't going to any job at all. And, you know, some of them financially can do it, and some of them have figured out how to do it. And so this isn't all just happening with one demographic. And I think that's really going to change the game also on work-life balance. I think people have, one of the things I think the pandemic really showed people is that life is short and you are not in control. And I think what's important for people is understanding that, this is not, you don't know what's going to happen, and you need to make the best of all of it and really make the most of all of it. And I feel like that is really going to propel sort of this future work, and be a future trend is a lot of choice. And companies are going to struggle with it. And it's in the ones that don't, and the ones that really adapt and think differently will win, because I think they're just going to figure out how to maximize talent.
Love it. Love it. Yeah, we have a marketing automation contractor. We found her on Upwork.
Yep.
And she had, I think, like a portfolio of 10 to 12 clients that obviously she worked for on a fractional basis. And 2 weeks ago, she was like, "Hey, Steven, can we chat for 5 minutes?" And I was like, "Oh no." Anytime I get that from an employee as a CEO, I'm like,
Yeah.
"Oh no, they're going to resign."
That's right.
And she said, "I have some news for you. I have accepted a full-time position, and which means I am no longer going to be able to support all the clients that I work on."
Mhm.
And I said, "Okay, well, wow, congratulations. Like,
Right.
I think this is awesome. They found, an amazing person
Mhm.
in you." And I said, "Well, and she had said, I have this period that I can continue to support." And I was like, "Well, is there flexibility? It's year end, blah, blah,
Mhm.
blah." And she was like, "Well, I could continue to work for you if we can work this way."
Yeah.
And essentially, she was describing the exact setup that you just mentioned. So
Mhm.
she was like, "I'm going to be available in the morning between 6 and 8, and I'm going to be available in the evening between 6 and 8." She's in the Czech Republic. So in some ways, it actually benefits us to be able to
Mhm.
work with her. And so I can see that absolutely. And I did not expect her to even put that
Right.
out there as an option.
But that's the
And that's
Amazon ad, like that brilliant Amazon ad that they just had. It's like, I'm going to work on the third Saturday of every month from 10 to 11 after, and it's like, I mean, there is some, and if you can adapt like you're doing, then you can still leverage all the amazing impacts that person can have. But, you're willing to pivot and work differently in order to do that. And so is she. That's not necessarily how everyone's going to respond to that situation. And I think that's going to be a differentiator in the future.
Yeah. So we have a few closing questions, and I know we only have a couple of minutes. Let's see if we can get through these. So question one, as a chief people officer, are there 3 to 4 metrics that you're looking at on a weekly basis that are really important for PTC?
Sure. I do look at early attrition because I really want to understand. It's maybe not weekly, but I look at least monthly to sort of understand, do we have people falling out early? They came to the job, they left for a reason. I think that one's a really important one for us. I look at talent mobility, I look at velocity of our talent. So really trying to understand people movement between jobs, between leaders. We're in the midst of trying to really set up sort of some dashboards for leaders to understand that, so that they can understand it's actually a behavior sort of tied to curious learning. If you want to have employees stay, they have to be doing different things. And so I look at that. I also look at what's going on externally for PTC, like what's the latest news? What are we hearing from analysts? What are we, I just want to get a sense of, sort of how's the storyline landing out there, what's going on externally. Those are a few of them. We do a lot around engagement too, and we're looking at what are some of the kind of levers in engagement for us. So trying to understand that a little bit better is something I've been spending some time on. And our hiring metrics, because of what's going on in general with the Great Resignation. Just understanding sort of what are some of the levers. We're seeing a lot of things like in India and things where you have candidates accept jobs and then they ghost, or they sort of accept and then decline, and they're going to start, and then the day before they start. So we're trying to understand that a little bit more to say, is that an us issue with the offers we're making? Is that just a moment in time that we just got to work through? So really understanding a little bit more to say, okay, is there something here that we could improve on, or is this just a moment because the market's so amazing?
Love it. So as someone that leads a 150-person function, are there any rhythms that, the entire function has in place to make sure that the entire team is rowing in the same direction? Do you have like a weekly or monthly meeting for the entire people team?
So we have all hands. They're usually monthly. We have lots of other things that we do, though. We'll do like smaller focus groups. We'll do, I rotate sometimes, like we have our total rewards team here. Right now, I just popped in for lunch, wasn't scheduled, but just sort of sit down with them. And, so I think, you don't get to do that as much, when you're not back in person, but we are in a hybrid situation right now. So some of the teams have chosen to, we're fully vaccinated. So some of the teams have chosen to get together. So some of them are impromptu and some of them are more organized. I also do a podcast and it's called Larsen Vision. So it's like a riff on WandaVision, but it's really just trying to get to know different leaders and allow our employees. I said half of them are outside the US and many of them are virtual still. And so how do they get to know people? Like how do they get to know me? And then how do they get to know other leaders? And we talk a lot about things like, how some of our boomer leaders are managing, Z and millennials and ones that are distributed all around the globe. And how do you navigate that? So we do some topics that we know everyone's trying to kind of manage through, or things that we thought might be top of mind.
I had no idea that we had a fellow podcaster on here with us.
Yeah.
Didn't either.
Yeah. Jill Vision. I love it. I love that show too. WandaVision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a couple of questions and we'll wrap this up,
Sure.
Jill. But my next question is there anyone in the people HR function, or maybe even someone that has been hugely influential in your career that you feel we should have on this show?
Oh, wow. Well, I don't know everybody you've had on the show. I'm going to assume Katie from HubSpot, Katie Burke, you've maybe had on. Have you had her from HubSpot?
No,
You should definitely have her on. HubSpot's doing something super interesting and just very engaging. And they just, I always look at companies, the HR people a lot of times will be the ones putting stuff out, but I always look when I see people say really consistent things. And they have a new CEO, female, and I think it's really interesting to watch how they're disrupting themselves. So that's an interesting company. I'm also Walmart is one that I have some friends there. I know Amy Goldfinger, who runs TA there. I don't know if you've ever had her on, but I have her in my classes sometimes talk about agile recruiting, and so they do a lot. This idea around like agile engineering, it's very similar. They do scrums, they do meetings that, they do, then it's got, you've got the Kanban boards and like, it's pretty amazing. And so, Walmart's doing some really interesting things. They're really going after sort of Amazon and different, FedEx, and they're really trying to kind of play in lots of different places. And, they've moved up a lot and they have, they've really become a great place to work. And so I watch that. I talk to them a lot, try to understand what they're doing, even though I'm not in retail, so we're not competitive, or B2C, but it's pretty fascinating to see some of the best practices that they do and what we could bring back. Can I adopt some of those things, even though I'm in a different, kind of technology space?
Love it. We'll have to reach out to both. They both sound like they would be
great.
amazing guests. So we're at the final stage of the show, which we call one word, one phrase, close. We all just share, a reflection on this conversation in a single word or phrase. So I'm gonna go fast because Daniel always beats me to the punch. My phrase is people revolution.
Yeah, you stole mine. Jill, you want to go next?
For me, it's kind of the rise of Z, like the rise of that generation and how amazing they're going to be.
Okay, so mine is Jill Vision. I just love all the wisdom you've shared with us, and I feel like you have some, really interesting, takes on what could potentially happen. Specifically, that last one you had about people having multiple full-time jobs or multiple jobs. So yeah, Jill Vision.
That's great.
Bill, thank you so much. I know there was a lot of coordination with our schedules, but we finally did it, and it was well worth the wait. So thank you so much, and I hope you and your family have a wonderful holiday.
Thank you. I would say the same to both of you. And thanks for doing this. I think it's amazing to just really continue to help us, learn best practices and connect with the function and challenge ourselves really. So I appreciate it.
Thanks,
All
Joe.
right. Thanks,
Talk to
guys.
you later.
Bye.
Happy holidays.